I'm Jay Editon.
And I'm Miles Stokes.
And we're the hosts of Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men, a weekly podcast all about the ins, the outs, and the retcons of comics' greatest superhero soap opera.
We're also the hosts of Jay and Miles Review the X-Men,
which you're watching right now,
where we talk about the X books that come out each week.
This week, we are continuing the wrap-up of the X lines as we head towards Resurrection or Resurrexion, depending on how you're pronouncing it on any given day.
Definitely not Resurrection.
With the comics of March 15th and 22nd, 2017.
Last week's only X book was Uncanny X-Men number 19, the last in the series. Written by Cullen Bunn with pencils by Edgar Salazar, inks by Ed Tadeo, and colors by Ulysses Areola. So yeah, this is it. After a bunch of Inhumans vs. X-Men tie-ins, this is the last issue of this run of Uncanny X-Men. And I gotta say, as a last issue, I think it does exactly what it should, which is to distill down what the book was about into a nice, simple kind of statement of purpose with an ending that packs a punch.
Yeah, it's funny. The last issues that we saw last week with Uncanny and this week with Extraordinary both kind of feel like the last issues of the series we wish they had been.
Kind of, yeah, because what I really like about this, so, okay, we fell in love with Cullen Bunn's X work with his Magneto ongoing from a while back. Now, in this last run, he's had a team book led by Magneto, but with a bunch of sort of X-Force-y kind of characters. And in this issue, we just have a fight and, conversation that happens during a fight, comic book style, between Magneto and Psylocke. We have this philosophical conflict between basically somebody who feels that the ends justify the means and somebody who's been trying to figure out her relationship with the concept of killing, with the concept of preemptive violence to prevent further violence. And it just distills everything Cullen Bunn's been trying to say this entire time in a way that makes a lot of the other stuff, as much as I liked, the Sabretooth stuff, the Monet stuff, etc., it makes it just feel like, I'm not going to say filler, but unnecessary, non-central.
Salazar on pencils is an interesting choice. I think he's good at the fight scenes. Mm-hmm. I think his Psylocke looks extremely white in ways that are kind of obnoxious.
Yeah.
And I'm also very, very grateful that this series did not end with its main artist.
I would agree, yeah. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about wrapping up this series in general in a moment. But as far as the issue, I mean, you have those two levels of the conflict between Magneto and Psylocke. You have the fight scenes, like you said, Jay, which I agree look freaking awesome. Yeah. Like, they're small scale, but they're also just so powerful, for lack of a better way of putting it. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, trees and rocks and stuff being thrown around and using mutant powers.
And then there's the conversation.
And this works because we have Psylocke, we have Betsy, who's incredibly conflicted about this whole thing, who feels bitter about having hoped that she could have made the world a better place without killing, and now she feels like she's forced to take Magneto out for all the bad things he did, supposedly for good reasons. And we have Magneto, who's totally confident. There's no question in his mind that he did the exact right thing, and if Betsy's trying to kill him, well, I mean, that was something he planned for. That was something he knew would be a possibility when he asked her to sign up on his team. And that, having the character who's more sympathetic be the one who's less certain, that fits Uncanny X-Men for me. Specifically, that fits X-Force for me, which this book is very much a successor to.
That fits the X-Men in general, I think.
Mm-hmm. But specifically the darker line that we've seen, honestly, since the X-Force run by Yost and Kyle years and years ago. Mm-hmm. Like, it's really been all about that question, all about the question of preemptive justice, basically.
I think this is a series that would have been really well served by playing more with the juxtaposition that it emphasized at the beginning and the end, that Psylocke and Magneto as that dichotomy. Mm-hmm. As they're moving in different directions. I really wish that we'd seen more of this develop over the course of the series, and more of it develop organically rather than in just those sort of in narration or declamatory conflicts.
Well, and also in a great big event. Inhumans vs. X-Men had a lot of cool stuff with it. I think the tie-ins were by and large pretty good. Mm-hmm. But when you have a series wrapping up with an event as a large portion of that wrap-up, it's going to inevitably lose a lot of what makes it itself and lose a lot of the opportunity to wrap up on its own terms. And I think that's a bit of what we saw here. As far as the series as a whole, you mentioned that you were glad that the series' regular artist, Greg Land, was not wrapping it up, and I agree. I mean, if we had to pick one flaw for what made the series not work, I would just say that Cullen Bunn and Greg Land were not a good fit. Whether you like Land's work or not, I just don't think they ever really clicked the way I was hoping that maybe they could, the way we saw glimpses, or at least I saw glimpses, of that being possible.
Well, and we were also looking at this, you mentioned Bunn's run on Magneto. Mm-hmm. And we were looking at this and inevitably, I think, comparing it to Cullen Bunn and Gabriel Hernandez-Walta.
Right,
And
yeah.
Jordi Belair collectively as a creative team.
Who were so good.
Who had just phenomenal narrative synergy.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to see more Cullen Bunn doing X work in X-Men Blue, one of the flagship books. Very different feel. It's about the kids instead of about darkety murder. I mean, I'm sure there will be some of that there too. So I'm definitely curious about that. We also know it has Magneto in it, so that will be interesting to see how that's handled, especially after the way this series has wrapped up. We're going to see more of Land on Weapon X, which, well, I liked Land's work best when he was working with Greg Pak in the past, so he's going to be again, so there you have it. And we're also, something that I just noticed in the June solicits for Marvel, we're probably going to see more Monet in Generation X. There's a silhouette that looks very much like her in her Emplate form. Makes sense. Emplate's a classic Gen X villain, so that's kind of cool. So the book's definitely going to have its legacy, both creatively and character-wise, for a while. I'm curious about all of that. As far as this series as a whole, I think it's absolutely worth reading. I think it wasn't everything it could have been. I think, for me, the good definitely outweighs the bad. What about you, Jay?
I'm looking forward to revisiting this in collection, because in issue, it did very little for me. I don't know as far as whether I'd recommend it or not. I'm really on the fence, and I'm leaning at this point toward no, just because it's a book that's coming out against the stronger books of this line, specifically All New X-Men and All New Wolverine, are so strong. And do such a good job of maintaining their own identities, even with the event going on behind them, that honestly, it's hard for me in good conscience to recommend the other titles. This and Extraordinary have had some very good isolated issues, but as runs go, they feel interstitial to me.
That said, let's go ahead and talk about Extraordinary, because this week, that's the series that wrapped up.
Next up is Extraordinary X-Men number 20. Written by Jeff Lemire, with art by Victor Ibáñez, and colors by J. David Ramos. This is, as with Uncanny X-Men, this wraps up this run in this era of Extraordinary X-Men, and it does it really nicely. Likewise, as with Uncanny, I think it's a last issue that ties up the series with a bow much neater, much more elegant, and much more appealing than what's inside the package.
I would agree, yeah. Like, this issue, the feel of it was everything I wanted out of Extraordinary X-Men. A book about this group of characters who are basically family, and who are having that family relationship strained by the events that are going on in the world around them, forcing them to compromise who they all want to be in order to just survive.
This is a book that should have been about identity. It should have been about the identity of the X-Men in the face of the rise of the Inhumans, in the face of their exile to Limbo, and in the face of the vast shifts in public opinion around them in the last 5 or 6 years. And it really hasn't been. It is a book that's really struggled to find its footing and its voice. And this issue makes me nostalgic and frustrated for the series that it might have been, because it hits every single one of those notes really, really beautifully. Some of that, I think, is the creative team. Ibáñez came onto this book relatively late. And Ibáñez and Ramos, as an art team, are really solid, do a really good job, and do a really good job of capturing both sort of the grit of their current circumstances and flashes that really, really beautifully evoke, maybe a brighter time.
Yeah, and to clarify, that's J. David Ramos, the colorer, not Humberto Ramos, who also worked on.
Well, he penciled the first stretch of this run.
And came back some.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. Like, Lemire and Ibáñez, they work well. And Ibáñez's style, just that sort of, I don't know, there's just this wistful, bittersweet quality to it, especially with Ramos's like slightly washed out colors that really fit the tone that this issue is going for, the tone of picking up the pieces of there just being a little bit left. Like, what it kind of reminded me of was the last day of summer camp, when a lot of your friends have already gone home. And so it's just like you and a couple people you only kind of knew, just trying to talk about, well, maybe we'll keep in touch. I'll never forget this whole thing.
Or where the last people there are the people who've been there every year and are now seniors, so aren't going to be coming back. Which I think is what we've really got in this issue, what we've really got at the end.
The ones who are staying around to turn off the lights.
Yeah. The other thing it feels like, actually, in light of that, is a really good transition to X-Men Gold.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, this is this issue is the best advertisement for X-Men Gold I could have imagined. Like, I really want to see what happens next with all of these characters.
So that's it for me. It's strange. This is not, you asked earlier if I'd recommend Uncanny X-Men overall. And I said I wasn't sure I would. And I kind of feel the same way about Extraordinary X-Men, although I will say I'd recommend this issue.
Yeah.
I would, if you're coming in now and you want to know what's been happening, skip 1 through 19, just pick up number 20, because it's great. It's lovely. It feels right, and I think it's going to be a really good lead into whatever comes next.
So as far as the series as a whole, I mean, we talked a little bit about a broader perspective with Uncanny. What's your take on Extraordinary?
I think it's been fragmentary. It's been fractured. There have been very good moments. There have been good single issues, but it's never really felt like a cohesive book. It's never felt like a book that had a common tone or thread, and it's always felt a little bit like someone chasing after a story and concept. I know it got off to a. I don't know exactly the circumstances under which it started, but my impression was that it was very rushed at first, and it feels like it never quite caught up with itself until now. It's a creative team that, and I've been judging it, I think, more harshly than I would because of the quality of the creative teams on it. I said very early on with Lemire and Ramos, part of what was so frustrating about the book was that it was based on the creative team and based on the cast, it was a book that I should love. And it was a book that I went in wanting to love and didn't. And it never quite recovered from that, I think, as a whole. There are again single issues that stand out as excellent and as well worth reading, but overall it's just, as with Uncanny, again, it feels interstitial. It feels like a run that filled some space and got us from point A to point B without ever having a very strong voice of its own.
But hey, props to the creative teams on both of these books, regardless of the overall qualities of the run, the ups and the downs, for sticking the landing intensely. Yeah. Great freaking last issues on both counts.
Okay, so that's 2 books reviewed and 2 series concluded. Miles, what's our pick of the fortnight?
So this one was hard because, like we said, each of these issues is a great wrap-up for their respective series.
Oh, for me, there was no question.
Well, we did definitely like one a little bit more than the other, or in the case of Jay, maybe a lot. That being Extraordinary X-Men number 20. Just the way it was firing on all cylinders thematically and emotionally, in terms of writing and in terms of art. Like, it's just a beautiful standalone issue of X-Men, regardless of whether it's the last issue of a series or what series it was even part of. So well done, everybody.
Yeah, it pushed all the right nostalgia buttons for us while moving forward. And speaking of nostalgia buttons, there is an honorable mention that we want to give out this week, and that goes to Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur number 17, which stars the X-Men and features some pretty amazing blasts from the past. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I will say it's a delightful issue. It is one where if you like the X-Men of the late 80s, and especially like the Outback era X-Men,
or even the early 80s,
you're gonna want to pick this one up. Also, I would say even if you're missing X-Men 92, it's got a lot of that same sort of buoyancy to it.
Totally. Well, and speaking also to a degree of nostalgia, what's our panel of the week?
Our panel of the week is from Extraordinary X-Men number 20, and we mentioned that this issue hits all of the right nostalgia buttons. And if you haven't read it, this is a slight spoiler, but if you're a longtime X-Men fan, I suspect you might already have known what was coming. It's not a standout panel, but it does what it does, and I'd say it's pretty much the best at it. And what it does is awfully nice.
That's it for this fortnight. Thanks for watching.
If you like what you've seen here, but would vastly prefer it without our faces, check out our podcast, Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men. New episodes go up every Sunday at explainthexmen.com, also on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. What have we got for them this week?
This week we are covering the 1990 annuals of X-Men and also Fantastic Four and New Mutants and X-Factor, Days of Future Present.
Oh man, so intense Franklin Richards reality warping fun.
Yeah, and it's a little incoherent, and there's a lot going on, and Ahab shows up, and it was hard to cram it all into one episode, but we had a lot of fun talking about it.
That podcast, these video reviews, and everything at explainthexmen.com come to you courtesy of our Patreon subscribers. We are an entirely listener-funded project, and those are the folks who keep us on the air and 100% ad-free. If you'd like to join their ranks, which we would love, you can do it at the link either above or below this video, depending on where you're watching it.
In the meantime, we will see you back on YouTube next week with some more series endings, and I do believe X-Men Prime. Very excited about that one. See you then.